In the 1960s, there were three presidents that played a huge role in crucial events such as the Cold War and the Vietnam War. We start off with President Eisenhower, a five-star general and hero in the Second World War. He ran in the 1952 presidential election as a Republican and won by a landslide. During his presidency, his domino theory and the tactic of brinksmanship built up the United States defense in order to stop communism from spreading by using nuclear threats. In the 1961 election, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon, helped by his image in the televised presidential debates. In his inaugural address, he stressed the need for Americans to be active citizens, famously saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy had many confrontations with the Soviet Union, including the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race. Considering the delicacy and danger of these situations, JFK did a good job avoiding a catastrophic war between the US and the Soviet Union. However, his presidency came to an end when he was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, was sworn in as the 36th president of the United States. He completed JFK's term and was elected in the 1964 election. He is majorly known for designing the Great Society and our involvement in Vietnam. He escalated our involvement in the Vietnam War using the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which led to many riots and bitterly welcomed troops. Despite his unpopularity regarding foreign policy, his domestic policy helped improve poverty and the civil rights movement.
The 1960s were full of many turning points in our nation's policies and ideology. One of the major events that occurred was the improvement of the status of minorities, specifically African Americans. Many African Americans were fed up of all the unjust racial prejudice that ran rampant through almost every street of America. Mass protests and peaceful demonstrations led by certain influential individuals such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks ignited across the country in hopes of the permanent desegregation of African Americans. This quest to create a more equal status of African Americans through nonviolent methods such as sit-ins was known as the Civil Rights Movement. Some policies that caused drastic changes legally throughout the U.S. in terms of segregation include the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and court cases such as Brown v. Board of Education and Tinker v. Des Moines as well. Events such as Freedom Summer and Freedom Riders, led by other activists, further promoted racial equality across America. There were a few influential people of the 60s who tragically passed away due to their assassinations. First, I'd like to address President John F. Kennedy, who was known for his campaign promises and was inaugurated in 1961 as the 35th President of the United States. He was a big supporter of the Civil Rights Movement, and he created temporary Peace Corps. However, Kennedy also had some failures when he was in office. For example, he sponsored the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, which turned out to be a great disaster. He was assassinated on November 22, 1963, while traveling in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, while attempting to bolster Democratic support for his campaign in the South. His shooter was recognized as Lee Harvey Oswald. After JFK died, LBJ filed in as president. Also, his brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated just 5 years later in 1968. Following World War II, the Cold War broke out, including the Red Scare and the Korean War. During Eisenhower's second term in the White House, Fidel Castro had come to power in Cuba and proved to be a brutal and totalitarian leader. When Castro came to power, he quickly aligned himself with Soviet communists, much to the despair of American leaders who hoped to maintain Cuba as an ally. Eisenhower approved a plan that called for the Central Intelligence Agency to train approximately 1,500 anti-Castro Cuban exiles for a Cuban invasion and takeover. Eisenhower's term ended before the training was complete, so Kennedy inherited responsibility for the program. His advisors assured him that the CIA-trained rebels would be victorious. So on April 17, 1961, the militia invaded the south coast of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Castro's army and supporters quickly repelled the invasion, leaving all but a few hundred of the invading militia either captured or killed. Just 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy suffered the humiliation of financing and backing the disastrous scheme. Americans questioned Kennedy's leadership.
That same year, Kennedy played a role in another major event of the decade in the Cold War, the Soviet construction of the Berlin Wall, which divided the German city into the East and West Berlin. Khrushchev, an experienced politician, refused to take the inexperienced Kennedy seriously as a world leader. To Kennedy's credit, he did not back down. With the understanding that Cuba was a sore spot for Kennedy after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Khrushchev began to place missiles there and aim them at the coast of Florida. After reviewing several options, the National Security Council decided to go with a plan labeled Quarantine, a euphemism for a naval blockade. October 1962, Soviet ships came near but stopped short of the U.S. blockade. 2 days later, a television reporter relayed a message from a representative of the Soviet embassy offering to remove the Cuban missiles if the United States agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Kennedy accepted the proposal, and Khrushchev removed the missiles on Sunday, October 28, 1962. After being on the brink of nuclear war, President Kennedy made huge strides in diplomatic relations with the Soviets. In 1963, the country was demolished by the assassination of JFK. Promises about the ongoing Vietnam War were not fulfilled. Johnson became president and cultivated the contrasting image of a resolute statesman by seizing upon the Tonkin Gulf episode. President Johnson ordered a limited retaliatory air raid against the North Vietnamese bases, loudly proclaiming that he sought no wider war. That the president was given power to use further force in Southeast Asia. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was a name given to the powers. The Vietnam War drained tax dollars from needed improvements in education and manufacturing capacity from the civilian sector.
The crux of the war was that the United States was losing and the public was not aware of it. General Westmoreland requested more troops. By 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000. As the war stretched on, some soldiers came to mistrust the government reasons for keeping them there. The same year, 35,000 demonstrators staged mass anti-war protests outside the Pentagon. With his approval rate dropping, Johnson promised to dedicate the rest of his term to seeking peace rather than re-election. Nixon sought to deflate the anti-war movement by appealing to a silent majority of Americans who he believed supported the war effort. In an attempt to limit the volume of American casualties, he announced a program of withdrawing troops and giving South Vietnam control of overground operations. In addition to this policy, which he called Vietnamization, Nixon continued public peace talks. The anti-war movement, which was particularly strong on college campuses, divided Americans bitterly. For some young people, the war symbolized a form of unchecked authority they had come to resent. For other Americans, opposing the government was considered unpatriotic.